Good morning. I have been asked to welcome you in 5 minutes. For a GCGC audience, that is either generous or merciful. I'll let you decide which. Welcome to NUS and Singapore. My name is Ernest Lim. Together with my colleague Umakanth Varottil, the conference chair, we are vice deans at the Faculty of Law, where I handle recruitment, promotion, and tenure, and Umakanth graduate studies, and we teach corporate law here. It is an honor to host you. Congratulations to the organizers for the longevity of this colloquium. This is the 12th edition since its inception at Stanford in 2015. Our host for this conference is the E.W. Barker Center for Law and Business at the Faculty of Law, whose director is Professor Hans Joe. Umakanth and I are deeply grateful to him for his support. The center bears the name of Edmund William Barker, Singapore's first Minister for Law and its longest serving. In 1965, Barker drafted the documents that separated Singapore from Malaysia. He wrote a country into being with a fountain pen. E.W. Barker joined legal craft to political instinct and a human touch. And from that, he found practical solutions. That seems not too different from sensible governance scholarship. The center that carries his name has hosted some of the finest jurists alive, including the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court of Singapore, Canada, and the United Kingdom, as well as some of you here. The center studies business law across borders, cross enough of them, and one truth becomes unavoidable. There is rarely one right answer in governance, only different answers shaped by different power. So the question is never only what the law says, it is whose law and why, which is close enough to the program of the next 2 days. In the early years of GCGC, our debates were domestic dramas, activists at the door, takeover defenses, agency costs, the right box on the proxy card. The stage was national, the cast was shareholders and directors. Then the ground shifted. Look at this year's program. Who really controls the modern firm? What happens when ownership concentrates in a few global hands? When voting becomes geopolitics? When exchange compete across borders for the same companies? When governance norms stop converging and begin to rebalance? The papers range widely, from common ownership to corporate purpose to executive pay. But one thread runs through them. Governance has been repoliticized and renationalized. The question is no longer only who controls the firm. It is whose value does the firm carry and who gets to decide. That is why Singapore is the right room for this. We are a crossroads by design, open, reliable, stable, forward-looking, and we sit on the fault line between East and West, between global North and global South, between state and market, between the old convergence story and whatever comes next. And look around this beautiful hall. It is not only professors. There are regulators here, lawyers, investors. The old division of labor has broken down. Scholars no longer simply evaluate the world while others change it. When governance becomes geopolitics, the two blur. Everyone here is now a participant. So here is my invitation for the next 2 days. Bring your rigor, bring your data, bring your healthy skepticism for one another's theories and models. But notice the moment we are in. Corporate governance has stopped being only about corporations. It is now about the world they and we live in. So let me leave you with two uncomfortable questions. Is corporate governance in crisis? Does it respond well to crises? Or is crisis simply the word we use when a field loses the certainties it was built on and has to earn new ones? In front of us today and tomorrow in this colloquium. Welcome to NUS and GCGC. I now hand over to Umakanth, the conference chair. Thank you.
A very good morning to all of you. On behalf of the National University of Singapore and my colleagues, several of whom are here, let me echo Ernest in extending a very warm welcome to all of you for GCGC 2026. Before we begin the scholarly proceedings for which Ernest has already set the tone, and something that you have all been looking forward to, I would like to briefly touch upon three things. First, a word about the conference and the level of interest that came about. Second, a few words about the venue. And third, some well-deserved thanks to the many people and institutions whose support made this event possible. So let me begin with this year's interest in GCGC. We actually approached this edition with a degree of trepidation. Singapore, our little red dot, nestled in the heart of Southeast Asia, is for most of you a journey of many thousands of miles. Hence, we were really uncertain about what the response would be. As it turned out, we need not have been worried at all. We received a remarkable 223 submissions, up from 187 last year. And I'm reliably informed by none other than Elaine that this is the highest number of submissions in the history of GCGC. So from that impressive pool, a number of papers were shortlisted after an initial round of screening, and from those, the final 11 were selected for the program. As you can see, the competition was intense, and understandably, the margin separating the chosen papers from the rest was, in most cases, very fine indeed. Moving on to our venue, many of you would be familiar with NUS Law's previous home at the Bukit Timah campus, which was quite historic in nature. Today, we welcome you to our new home here on the main Kentridge campus. I encourage you to take a few minutes during the lunch and coffee breaks to explore the surroundings. The University Town Green, which is about a 5 to 7 minute walk from this hall, is well worth a stroll. And there's no shortage of excellent places to savor some of the local cuisine, in case some of you don't have the time to do that at other times during the weekend and so on. This brings me to the last part, which I consider the most important, which is the thanks. I would like to begin by thanking the members of the GCGC board for the vision and leadership in building what has become the premier global forum for corporate governance scholarship. Members of the selection committee took on the unenviable task of reviewing and selecting the papers, and I'm grateful to each one of them for their time, diligence, and judgment. And many of them are here in this room. We were also ably supported in the preliminary screening process by two colleagues, Johan Sulaiman from the NUS Business School and Kenneth Koo from the law school, who were generous with their time and expertise in supporting the selection committee. I would like to extend my thanks to the E.W. Barker Center for Law and Business at NUS for hosting this conference, and in particular, the director, Professor Hans Chio, as well as Alicia Chia, Ephraim Sofian, Failasuf, Joshua Ko, and Diana Zakaria, whose behind-the-scenes efforts have been indispensable. You won't see them around, but they've been involved in a lot of the work that's gone on behind the scenes. We are immensely grateful to the Singapore Exchange, SGX, for generously hosting tonight's conference dinner, and I'll say a little bit more at the dinner itself. And as always, GCGC Secretariat, Elaine McPartlin and Suzanne Harley have worked tirelessly for months on end, but always with good cheer. I genuinely shudder to think what we would do without them. Please give them a round of applause. Finally, and most sincerely, thanks to all of you in this room, presenters, discussants, chairs, panelists, and attendees, who've traveled from near and far to be here. It is really your engagement and expertise that makes GCGC what it is. I hope you have 2 wonderful and intellectually stimulating days ahead. Thank you very much for being here. And without further ado, let me hand over to my colleague Lulu to kickstart the first proceedings for which all of you are here. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Luh Luh Lan from the National University of Singapore, Faculty of Law. So I'll be your session chair for the first session. And how the program will run is the speaker will get 15 minutes, the discussant 10 minutes, and we'll have a Q&A session followed. After that, it will be 20 minutes. And so for our first session, we'll be having Dorothy Lund, who will be speaking on the proxy voting choice revolution. Dorothy, thanks.
All right, thank you, Lulu. Thank you to the National University of Singapore and ECGI for another great conference. And thank you to everybody who's fighting their way through jet lag to be here at the first session of the day. So I'm going to just jump right in because there's a lot to talk about in this paper. I'll start by maybe framing the motivation for how we came to this project. And over the past few decades, U.S. capital markets have become increasingly concentrated in the hands of institutional asset managers, and this has attracted a lot of attention. And some of it has been from scholars like me. I was very critical early on of these asset managers, arguing that they weren't doing enough to serve as stewards of their portfolio companies. Others began to attack them for doing too much, especially on ESG issues. And so this led to concerted public backlash against the big 3, and this term includes Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. And the backlash came in the form of litigation, regulation, and more. And so what happened is these asset managers faced an impossible choice. Do we participate in governance and get criticized for what we're doing? Do we sit it out and get yelled at because we're not doing enough? And so by no coincidence, in 2022, each of the big 3 said, well, we are going to expand voting choice programs that's going to allow our underlying investors to have the power to direct their own proxy votes. We're not going to keep the power for ourselves anymore. And so in our project, we wanted to better understand, hey, what does this mean, right? What does this proxy voting choice mean for our corporate governance ecosystem as a whole? And just a preview for you, we think this is a really fraught project, okay? So blockholder concentration presents real risks. It also provides some benefits. So if you have a large block, this is going to somewhat mitigate rational apathy. It's going to increase your returns to stewardship. It's going to be more likely then that the large block holder is going to be more informed and engaged. Also, if you're a block holder, you're a repeat player, right? You're engaging in governance on an ongoing basis, and you can maybe learn, you can set some market-wide governance standards. The presence of block holders can actually also lower the costs for activists because it makes it easier for activists to coordinate, and it makes it easier for management to communicate with shareholders. So, this is not to say that block holding has no risks, but this move towards diffusion also has risks, and we think it needs to be thought through really carefully. And so, in order to do this, to think through the many unresolved design questions that are outstanding, we provide the first ever study of a large asset manager's proxy voting choice program, and it generates all sorts of insights. So before I give you, some more information about that, I want to tell you just a little bit about the voting choice, how it's taking place, not just at Vanguard, which is the subject of our study, but across the big 3. And so what I'll start off by saying is voting choice isn't entirely new. Asset managers have historically given institutional clients participating in separately managed accounts the ability to cast their own votes. But in 2023, what we saw was a big expansion to a wider set of institutional shareholders and also retail investors. So that's one commonality across these 3 programs. Each program also works by saying we're going to select a menu of guidelines that are going to be developed by third-party proxy advisors, and you can select one of those guidelines, and that will dictate how your votes are cast. It's available on an opt-in basis, so this means if you don't opt in, the default is your vote will stick with the asset manager, and each of these asset managers has committed to expanding. There are some differences, right? The BlackRock has a ton of policies, 16. They also have they're relying on advice from Egan-Jones, Glass Lewis, and ISS. That's, wider spectrum than the other asset managers. They also have the most uptake. Vanguard, by contrast, only has 5 policies across 2 advisors. Okay, so now dialing into Vanguard, which is what we studied. The Vanguard's policy, and we studied it over 3 years, but as of March 2025, which is when we kind of finished our data collection exercise, we had 8 funds that were eligible to participate. This is for a total value of $264 billion in AUM. By the way, this has since expanded, in the months since we finished our data collection exercise to $1 trillion. So this thing is moving fast. If you select into proxy voting choice, you have 5 policies that you can choose from. You can go with Vanguard's own voting policy. You can go with the company board aligned policy. You can pick the Glass Lewis ESG policy. You can have your votes mirrored on what the rest of the market is doing. And the newest member of these, this cast of characters is the Egan-Jones wealth-focused policy, which basically says it's almost like an anti-ESG policy. They say we're only focusing on value and are inclined to not support ESG. So I'll just quickly say, what's coming. Each of these asset managers has said we are planning to expand to all U.S. equity index products. Okay, so the big 3 manage about $25 trillion. So this is going to eventually encompass 20% of the U.S. equity market. So this is a big deal. And there are some statements from investors suggesting that investor interest is quite substantial. Okay, so data collection. We took a look at these 5 policies, and and the 8 Vanguard funds that could select for them over the course of 3 proxy seasons. And Vanguard, unlike other asset managers, provides a lot of data about how the funds have voted. So from there, we were able to get the voting records for each fund over these different proxy seasons. We then categorized each proposal as falling into one of 8 categories. You'll see more about this in a second. We also looked at the fund disclosure on Form NPX, which shows the number of shares and how they were voted. And if you had votes going in different ways, this was actually disclosed for each policy. So this allowed us to calculate the uptake for each voting policy. And with this data, we sought to answer 3 questions. So 1, how does my selecting for a particular policy give me votes that are going to be different from what I would have gotten from Vanguard? The second is we just wanted to know more about who participates, what are they picking? And then we also wanted to better understand the impact of this, doing some counterfactual analysis, assuming full participation. Okay, so let's start with the first question here, again, which is, how do these policy options produce different votes from what Vanguard Stewardship Group is doing? So the first place to look is Vanguard's voting versus the management policy. And maybe unsurprisingly, there's not a whole lot of disagreement between Vanguard's voting and management's voting. If, for example, look at the mega cap index for the director elections, they voted the same way in almost 1,200 different votes. So overall disagreement is quite low across all funds. This is a little different when we get to the Glass Lewis ESG policy. Here we see high disagreement across all funds and all categories, and there's some really surprising sources of disagreement. I'm sorry for the small font, guys. I know even with this thing blown up, you guys are probably squinting. But if you look over at auditor ratification, this is, I think, one of our more interesting results. The ESG policy voted differently than Vanguard's choice 74% of the time in the case of the mega cap index fund. Okay, so maybe not what we would have expected from an ESG policy. So we wanted to better understand what makes the ESG policy special. So then we zoomed into the Glass-Lewis benchmark policy. And to be clear, this isn't a voting choice option. This was just a way for us to kind of get at differences between these policies and, hey, what makes Glass-Lewis ESG special and different from its benchmark recommendations? And here we see a moderate level of disagreement across all categories, with the exception of auditor ratification, where again we have 0% disagreement. And this shows that many pay packages, auditors, and director elections that Glass-Lewis would have supported under its flagship policy are now deemed problematic under the ESG policy. And we looked into this a little bit and basically realized that there was a real difference in how these policies are constructed. So the ESG policy adheres to a stricter rule set. There's a lot more fixed rules, like, hey, if you have a 10-year auditor relationship, we're just going to vote against you no matter what. Whereas the benchmark policy allowed for more discretion and more nuance. Okay, so then we looked at the newest policy choice, the wealth-focused policy. And again, overall disagreement levels are low, but they cluster in 3 different areas. So say on pay votes, governance proposals, and proxy contests. But there was no disagreement between voting between Vanguard and Egan-Jones on environmental proposal, and very negligible voting differences on social proposals. Okay, so the next thing we wanted to know is, can we figure out why we got different votes from the ESG policy and the benchmark policy? And so we actually went through and hand-matched divergent votes to the policy text. And for a lot of votes, we couldn't figure out a policy justification. For 350 votes of 1,000 votes, roughly 33%, these could not be attributed to any language in the guidelines providing an answer. And we tried. We called Vanguard. We said, what are we missing? They gave us additional things to look at. We looked at those. We still could not figure out why there were these differences. And so I think this really reveals that there's a lot of discretion going to the proxy advisor in these moments. Okay, the last thing that I want to share with you all is a participation analysis. Who's participating? Again, a really small font, but you can see that in our first panel here, most AUM is not opting into voting choice, and they're instead defaulting into the Vanguard advised policy. And you can also see in this slide that there's a real difference in terms of size of funds. So the largest far and away fund is the Dividend Appreciation Fund. And so for that Dividend Appreciation Fund, the most popular choice is the board-aligned policy, which we know votes very similarly to Vanguard's own voting policy. That board-aligned policy, you can see, is the most popular overall as between these, although Egan-Jones, in its 1 year of being offered, is creeping up in popularity. The highest level of participation is coming in the ESG stock ETF, where you have almost 4% of investors choosing the ESG policy. Okay, so now I bet some of you in the room are thinking, oh my gosh, you said this was a revolution. You're showing me very little that is different from what the current state of affairs. So what do you mean, Dorothy? Why is this a revolution? So I want to tell you why I think this is nonetheless potentially, even in this current form of the design choices that are being made, could be really impactful. And to do this, I want to show you some results from 2 counterfactual analyses that we did. So, in our counterfactual analysis, we basically said, okay, let's imagine we have 100% participation across all Vanguard equity index funds. Again, this is where we're going, right? So not a stretch. And that these voting patterns basically hold up as this program expands. If this happened, 14 shareholder proposals would have flipped in 2025. And it flipped in a way that maybe is going to be intuitive to a lot of people in this room. Vanguard was supporting management a whole lot in 2025, and so proxy voting choice ended up kind of chipping away at that support. We got the passage of shareholder proposals that Vanguard and management had opposed. We saw the failure of say-on-pay votes that Vanguard and management supported. So in 2025, we see the voting choice kind of directionally empowering shareholder activists who are chipping away at Vanguard's pro-management voting. We saw something different when we did this analysis in 2024. So again, this is a smaller set of companies because proxy voting choice in 2024 had a less large scope. So only 2 shareholder proposals would have flipped. A proposal to adopt a majority vote and a proposal to declassify the board had passed, they would have failed under our counterfactual analysis. And so, this shows us, again, maybe something sort of intuitive. If Vanguard is challenging management, pass-through voting is going to make those challenges more difficult. And the bottom line here is that the expansion of proxy voting choice is going to empower activists when Vanguard opposes them. It's going to hamper activists when Vanguard supports them. And we're signaling this sort of unraveling in the status quo of corporate governance where we've had, again, this flawed dynamic, but now we kind of know what to expect, right? We can count on the big 3 to be bellwethers for what's coming. Okay, I see that I only have 2 minutes to go, so I'm going to speed up. I'm going to talk about program design, get as much out here as I can. And I'll just say, I think this is really important because, although we've studied these programs as like a snapshot in time, each of these asset managers is trying to figure out how to do this in a way that makes sense. There's a lot of things that they haven't quite figured out. And regulators are also trying to figure this out. So there's a world in which this could all shift in ways that are really interesting. So, I want to tell you a little bit about, the main participants here and how they have these, flawed incentives. We know investors are rationally apathetic. Asset managers are too. And in particular, as I've said before, if you diffuse their governance power, it's going to weaken their incentives to participate. Third-party proxy advisors who are participating here, something that's interesting, they earn a fixed fee for a policy regardless of the performance, regardless of how many investors choose it. So we don't think that's great from an incentive perspective. Maybe there's some competitive discipline here. They are players in governance that can help. But these incentive issues have thus far shaped what we've seen in proxy voting choice. And I also think that it gives us some insight into what we should seek to do going forward as we evaluate proxy voting choice programs. And in that spirit, I have 2 design parameters that will, again, kind of carry through in the rest of the discussion. We think that as we move forward with the world of proxy voting choice, a well-designed system will do 2 things. It won't cause asset manager power to plummet, right? Because, again, of those benefits that come from block holding. And second, if any erosion in asset manager power is going to translate into gains in shareholder power. So that means we don't want proxy voting choice to empower proxy advisors. We want it to empower investors. So let me just say a few things here quickly, and then I'll wrap up. The populating the menu is one design choice that exists, right? Right now, we have third-party proxy advisors coming up with these menus, and that makes a lot of sense in that you can't imagine an underlying rationally apathetic investor to be able to select votes for any given thing. They're going to need to rely on something that will help mitigate that rational apathy. So it's not surprising that we are where we are with the menu approach, but it has its limits, right? So yeah, selecting a policy is going to mitigate investor rational apathy, but it's not going to solve it. We don't necessarily think that investors are going to read and comprehend these policies such that they would realize, hey, I'm selecting the ESG policy. That's going to translate into a vote against the auditor 75% of the time, when the benchmark policy supported it 100% of the time. So there's a real risk of hidden agendas sneaking into these menus. And so one of our main insights on menu design is, given this rational apathy, if you're an asset manager offering a menu, you can't offer 100 different options. You have to offer a small enough number that investors can kind of, synthesize what's going on. And if you were to do that, those menus would differ from as many different dimensions as possible to fill in the spectrum of investor preferences. And that's exactly what we saw, right? We saw a lot of voting disagreement in one policy, ranging to almost none. At the end of the day, though, do we think that 4 policies with only 2 substantive offerings that really differ a lot in each way is going to capture the nuanced preference of investors? I don't think so. And so I'll just say one thing about the default, which I think is another really important design choice that's up in the air at the moment. We ultimately kind of like this default rule of vote staying with the asset manager because, again, it's going to preserve blockholder incentives. We like it a lot more than something else that the SEC has proposed that asset managers should do. They say the default rule should be that you vote exactly as the people who have opted into voting choice have directed you to do. So, we're going to magnify those people who opt in. We think this is a terrible idea, right? This is going to totally diffuse blockholders. It's going to disempower shareholders because these people that are opting in are not necessarily representative. They're probably pretty idiosyncratic. Mirror voting is another one that's on the table. We think this is better than the opt-in default. But again, you're going to eliminate the benefits of blockholders in the ecosystem. So I think I'll just conclude there and hand the mic to Merritt to tell me what I've got wrong here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dorothy, and I want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to comment on this very rich paper. The paper has, as you can tell from the presentation, both an empirical angle to it and a normative angle. And I want to talk a little bit about each, kind of distill what I think is the most important empirical result and the most important kind of normative conclusion, and talk a little bit about each of those. So let me start with the empirical. And I think it's fair to say that the basic conclusion is here that expanded voting choice could have a meaningful impact on corporate governance by, in essence, effectively channeling investor preferences. And the way that conclusion was brought about was through taking a look, as Dorothy explained, taking a sample and then making certain assumptions about what would happen if voting choice was expanded to include everyone. So one is that it's simply made available to all Vanguard funds. Vanguard said it's going to do that. Secondly is that all investors opt in and choose one of these voting choice programs. And third, that all of the ones that do opt in will vote in the same proportions as the sample group did. And based on that, as Dorothy explained, she concludes that out of the 132 so-called close votes, closer than 60-40, 14 would have flipped. And I think that's a very striking conclusion in the sense that these are obviously the ones where Vanguard's vote could have been pivotal. So I want to kind of look at this result from a couple of points of view. First, I want to just simply accept all of those assumptions and then ask the question, does this suggest that that voting choice meaningfully channels investor preferences in an effective way? So a couple things to note to start with. One is, if voting choice is going to have this effect, it's when the voting choice plans vote differently than Vanguard. Otherwise, there's nothing going on here of significance. And the second is, in their survey at least, there were basically two funds that would do the work of channeling investor concerns of some kind, the Glass Lewis ESG fund and the Egan Jones wealth-focused fund, they need to be voting in ways that reflect the preferences of their distinct clienteles. So, what are those clienteles? Well, presumably the Glass Lewis ESG fund's available for investors who think that sometimes there are ESG behaviors by corporations that corporations ought to pursue, even if that may mean some kind of sacrifice in return, and who fear that Vanguard is going to be simply pushing corporations to maximize share value. And then presumably the Egan-Jones is available for investors who, in some sense, really do want corporations to maximize share value, and who fear that Vanguard sometimes would vote in ways that push corporations to pursue some kind of ESG aim. So, what do we really see? Well, the print here is pretty small, but this is table 6 in the paper. But let me just kind of summarize it. One is that out of the 14 cases of the close votes where if we expanded the sample to and assumed everything would happen the same way, in 11 out of those 14, the two plans voted the same way. And in the other three, when they divided, the ESG fund got 1 and the EJ fund got the other 2. So, one way of interpreting these results is it looks just like voting choice plans just added some noise rather than effectively channeling shareholder-specific preferences in ways that affect outcomes. An alternative is that maybe each of the plans' kind of outsidedness is what matters, that they're simply not Vanguard. And here, it's interesting to notice that in 10 of the 11 cases, the two, when they were voting together, were voting against management. So, that suggests, I think, one of two things. Either the vote was not expected to have an ESG effect, and maybe that's the case from some of the things that Dorothy talked about, or, and I think this is probably less likely, management abetted by Vanguard was ignoring some kind of pro-ESG conduct that also would improve share value. Now, the second empirical question I want to address is to question the assumptions. Again, there are 3 assumptions in which they take the sample and then grow and say, if this was expanded, we'd get these results where the funds would sometimes have some kind of effect in pivotal areas. One is voting choices expanded to all Vanguard funds. Well, we know they're planning to do that, so check that box. But the other 2 I'm a little more skeptical about. So one is all investors opt in and choose a program. Well, in the sample, right, only 2.8% opted in. That's a long way, right, from all. Now, all we don't have to mean all, but, would a substantial percentage opt in? The paper, and Dorothy notes this, says that there's a survey showing a lot of interest. I think the paper needs to go further than that to convince us that a substantial number of people would opt in, given the small number that did. So either provide some rationale or further evidence. The third assumption I'm a little skeptical of also, so, that's to the extent that, participation is expanded above this 2.8% level, that everybody would vote in the same way. Because presumably a lot of the people who didn't opt in because they were perfectly happy with how Vanguard was voting. If they're kind of pushed to choose a program, well, then which program will they choose? Well, one of the options was vote the same way that Vanguard would. And that suggests to me that the percentage choosing Vanguard advised would go up maybe significantly from what is already 35%. Now let me just wrap up by talking a little bit about the paper's key normative conclusion, which is that a properly designed voting choice system, Dorothy talked a little bit about what that design might be, could achieve what the paper calls a Goldilocks solution. And the idea here is funds would continue to be quite important, and that's a good thing for all the sort of positive things we know about blockholder voting of this kind, but that the choice plans would provide a, quote, safety valve that helps correct some of the identified problems with fund voting. I think that this also needs to be just kind of, that safety valve concept needs to be drawn out a little bit more. What is the safety that's being sought? So let's just kind of think about the kinds of criticisms that are launched at fund voting. One category, I think maybe there's some subcategories, and this is concern that the funds are failing to use or threaten to use their votes in ways that encourage managers to maximize share value. And this could be a result of a couple of different phenomena. One is the funds don't devote enough resources to detecting problems of non-share value maximization. There it seems implausible that the choice funds would be better resourced to do that. So I don't think they're going to be a safety valve that way. The second, maybe there's something going on here, the concern that the funds are kind of conflicted. They're in league with management because they want management for other business, and maybe that very fact, that outsidedness thing that comes out of the empirical result helps support that, but I think this needs to be drawn out more. A second criticism, is that that the funds actually don't reflect investor sentiments where they would prefer that companies pursue ESG concerns. I have trouble seeing exactly how ultimately these marginal votes could have that effect, but I think that again needs to be worked out further. And then the final possibility is a concern that basically the personal values of fund managers for social concerns is dominating the funds pushing firms to share value maximize. There, obviously, conceivably, the EJ fund could have some kind of effect to the extent that you think that this is really going on. But I guess my bottom line here is simply, I think the safety valve idea is an interesting one, but needs to be fleshed out more. Thank you.
We'll have Dorothy to respond to Merritt's comment, and we'll take questions from the floor.
I think this is Merritt's getting a deep idea that I didn't do a great job of fleshing out in this paper, which is why are we doing this, right? What's the point of this voting choice? And I think we lean heavily on a paper by Nadia Malenko, who I think is here somewhere, but she basically in a modeling paper says voting choice has can have one of two goals. Maybe the underlying investors have better information than the asset managers, or maybe they have some certain different preference that is not going to be reflected in the asset manager's voting. And so we basically say, well, in the case of a retail shareholder who's investing with Vanguard, the information advantage just isn't there. So it must be that this is all about preference aggregation, right? So the safety valve aspect of it is, well, hey, maybe there's some different preference that you have that isn't being reflected, and that's how proxy voting choice could really add value. But I take Merritt's point, which is that if we look at the data here, it's not clear that that's exactly what's going on. And I think we're pretty critical of the proxy advisor role at this point in time. And Merritt's, I think, additional empirical evidence was really useful in kind of teasing this out, right? Is it clear that these proxy advisors are doing things in a way that we would expect? And so I think we have ideas in the paper about, could we do things to encourage proxy advisors to participate more in a better way? Should we be imagining something different, like what Jill has proposed, that we just have asset managers surveying investors? We think that those aren't the right way to go, but and I can say more about that if anyone wants. Last thing on the assumptions, yes, I think the assumptions are assumptions, and we can all quibble with them. I think on that second assumption that that participation will increase, the first thing I'll say is that all of these asset managers is frantically trying to drive up participation as much as they possibly can. Something that I don't actually think is the right idea. Again, if we think the best possible case for this is that some idiosyncratic person has a safety valve, well, I don't think we need 100% of investors participating. Nonetheless, the asset managers are really trying to find a way to increase participation. The other thing I'll say is that our counterfactual analysis is just looking at Vanguard. What's going to happen when there's 3 large asset managers that are doing this in a big way, and everybody's seeking to increase participation? I think then we could see really big differences, maybe in different directions than we've seen in this analysis. But okay, I'm going to stop there. I'd love to hear thoughts, questions.
Thank you, Dorothy. Super interesting project. I have 2 questions. One is, can you give us a feeling of how detailed those menus, those policy options are? Because it seems to me they need to balance to have some flexibility that you talked about in allowing deciders and ultimately some choices, but that may deter people from opting into them, because if there's too much flexibility, then the feeling might be that you're basically buying something that is full discretion at the end of the day, and that might not reflect your preferences. That's point number 1. And the second one is, the changing voting behavior that you described, that you talk about, is one thing, but what's the long-term consequence on firms' behavior, right? That's the next question. So if the voting might change, as you suggest, does that ultimately also lead to firms then changing their behavior in response and already anticipating a different sort of voting pattern? So is that going to lead to different behavior in firms responding to those preferences?
Dorothy, I think it's very interesting point that you're making about this revolution, but I would like to ask you the question, how binding the policy is on the voting behavior of asset manager. And the reason why I'm asking this is that in a bunch of behavioral and financial economists in the Netherlands and also in Amsterdam, where I'm based, figure out that they can teach beneficiaries of funds how to transform their preferences into consequentialism by exposing them to what impact investing means. But they've done it in a setting in which the fund, which happens to be a pension fund, but it doesn't matter. Institutional content is different. The fund commits to execute exactly the action that has received the majority of votes. So I wonder whether this system in the U.S. institutional environment would be binding on the asset manager and therefore constitute commitment also to leaving money on the table for impact. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
A couple of general comments. So you said that in terms of that the block holders can do a lot of good because they have power. And therefore, it's good for the votes to go back to them if people don't take participation choice, which is happening now. However, I want to question this assumption, because if the big three were using their big power in a good way, we wouldn't want to do all of this in the first place. The reason why we are in this discussion is because of the literature that say the big three are doing a poor job. I personally have spent a lot of time explaining why they have poor incentives. You, Dorothy, had a paper which also didn't think highly of what they were doing. And actually, the reason why they speak political heat is not because of our papers, but because public officials in Washington think that they are doing a good job. So to the extent that we put back a large fraction of the voting power still to them, as long as not everybody is doing it, we are really going in the opposite direction of what the literature sentiment. Secondly, and that's connected to this, when you started talking, it was the early Dorothy, like the early Wittgenstein, you were saying that was skeptical of the big three, because you were saying, look, the reason why they are doing this is there was heat on them, everybody was unhappy of them, they were trying to run and camouflage and just get this hot potato out of their way. But if that's our assumption about their motivation, then I think your attitude, your approach to the whole thing should be different, because there is absolutely no reason to think that they would design it well, because they don't have incentives to design it well. They have incentives, according to what you say, is to get as little political heat as possible and to camouflage things as well as possible. So whatever the term well-designed means, it can't mean a system that Vanguard, if it reads your paper carefully enough, would do, because they don't have incentives to do that. If we were to have any well-designed system, it would have to come from someone else, GCGC, the SEC.
Just quickly, I think what would be interesting, building on a little bit the noise argument that Merritt made, how responsive are these bespoke voting policies to investor preferences in their design, and what's the business model of those who are actually building them? Because that would tell you probably a little bit more how they could evolve over time, and that they're because if it stays as it seems to be, like in your data, then the uptake should actually be on a downward sloping trajectory, because it seems not to matter that much.
Yeah, Jill?
So 2 very quick points. Dorothy, I love this paper, and I love what you've taught us about what's going on here. One thing that your chart shows that you didn't really exploit is at the extreme. I think this shows us some degree of meaningful investor segmentation based on preferences, right? So what you see is the ESG fund is selecting the ESG voting policy, right, to an extreme, more than any other fund, and it's 80% or something like that. So it's a crude, the ESG fund is crude, it's a crude preference, but these are exactly the investors that you might expect. So at some level, this is working, and this is responding to investor choice. The other thing, and this is a partial response to Lucian, you talked about this puzzle that the funds are trying so hard to get investors to do this. Well, one of the choices that investors can make through voting choice is saying, hey, I like the fund's voting policy. So this is a way of re-legitimizing, right? So most investors might be saying, look, I wanted to delegate to the asset managers. I'm happy with what the asset managers are doing. This is a response to like the hedge fund criticism. Vanguard's voting with management too much. Maybe retail investors like voting with management, and they like Vanguard exercising the judgment. So I think you might actually, both of those are sort of ways in which, at a very crude level, this might be getting investors what they want.
Last, Genevieve, and that's it. Genevieve?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Building on things that have already been said, so Merritt had this neologism. I think it's a neologism, outsidedness, right? So, and if we dig on this, so those are, the votings is actually vehicles for identity expression, right? And here I question what Jill just said. I wonder, because if you actually make the effort, you get out of the statistical bias and you make the effort of voting, probably it's more likely to be, to protest. And then I was interested by the names, the labels that are put on these programs. So, I want, welfare, value maximization. Well, okay, value maximization, but how, what is the incentive, as Lucien said, for the content actually to match this? Is this perhaps just a vote for the label? And once you have voted for the label, probably there might be something like trust substitution, and monitoring will be reduced even less, so giving actually more authority to the proxy advisors.
3 minutes.
Okay, 3 minutes. Let's see how I do, and we'll continue the conversation into the coffee break if anyone wants. But yeah, so I'll start with Genevieve's last question, and just to echo this is another thing that I didn't highlight, but we think is strange, right? This Egan-Jones wealth maximizing policy. What does this mean about the other policies, right? What's the implication? And it kind of, again, gets to the difficulty where I started with the complex incentive interaction of this cast of characters, right? You have these rationally apathetic investors who probably aren't reading beyond the headline and some summary that Vanguard is giving them, and they go, ooh, wealth maximizing, that's fabulous. Let's pick it. And as a result, we've seen this dramatic uptake of this policy. Is this so good? Again, I think it was a brilliant move by Egan-Jones to market themselves in this way, but what makes them wealth maximizing when the ESG policy also purports to be wealth maximizing is an interesting question. I think I'll go to Lucien and Jill's comments next. I think, of course, Lucien and I have both written about the flaws with asset manager voting, and this is not to put them on a pedestal and say, well, everything I've ever said here is wrong, that asset managers are perfect actors, but it's to say, okay, when we're going to talk about massively changing this system that has come up, and we now kind of are aware of how it works and what the flaws and disadvantages are, but what the advantages are as well, what's the alternative? And I'm not sure that we're moving in a better direction when we say, hey, let's select the default to be, to mirror the rest of the market. Eric and I are working on a paper now just studying mirror voting and how it can alter strategic behavior between market participants. And so I think there's just not a lot we know yet about mirror voting and the stuff that can come up. I also think the opt-in mirroring is a terrible idea for the reasons I've said. So this isn't to put the asset managers on a pedestal. And as Jill said, if we look at how they're thus far participating, many of them are choosing to vote in ways that are pretty consistent with how the asset managers are voting. Which suggests, it may not be too far off what they're doing. I think I also agree, Lucien, though, that this is maybe another agency cost of agency capitalism, to quote Jeff. The idea that these asset managers are in charge of designing these programs, and we know they have flawed incentives, suggests they're not going to do the good thing, right? They have. If we could imagine we had a world where asset managers could go out and interview each investor and perfectly reflect their preferences and then translate those into votes, right? That's far too costly for them to do. They will never do it, right? Because of the collective action problems. And so, I think this agency problem absolutely translates to the adoption of proxy voting choice. I didn't have a chance to get to the end of the presentation where we talk about how we think regulators could come in and maybe help. We basically think there should be a whole lot more disclosure of what these proxy voting choice programs are doing, how the votes are going. The fact that it took four of us, three of us with PhDs in economics to get these results suggests it's pretty hard for the average person to figure out how proxy voting choice is actually being translated into votes. So we think there should be more disclosure. We also think that there potentially should be a reworking or some guidance given about fiduciary duty, both of asset managers. What should you be doing as an asset manager as a matter of your fiduciary duty in implementing these proxy voting choice programs, and possibly for proxy advisors as well. So that's, I guess maybe I should conclude there, although more to say hopefully over the coffee break. Thank you so much.